Today, we take a look at the oldest known breed of cattle on the planet, the gentle and multi-purpose Swiss brown cow. The Swiss Browns are a quadruple threat, bringing you everything a cow possibly could. Meat, leather, drafting, and all of the rich, creamy milk you could ever dream of having. Without further ado, let's take a look at the gentle giant, the Swiss Brown. The brown Swiss cattle, or Braunvieh as they're sometimes called, is a breed that's over 4,000 years old. And as of today, it's the oldest living breed of dairy cattle in existence. Now we say 4,000 years, but that's just how far back archaeologists have been able to positively date them. Even they believe that they have been in existence for much longer than that. The oldest specimens were found in the ancient settlements of Swedish lake dwellers, and our modern brown Swiss still resemble those of their ancestors. Originally, they were kept and bred to be a dual-purpose breed. Back then, the more versatile an animal was, the more valuable it was to people. Unlike today, where we have the resources and the ability to rear an animal for a singular purpose, back then, they needed to get as much from a single head as possible. Inevitably, as people's needs and resources changed, so did their livestock as they bred them to have more specific purposes. The brown Swiss was no different. By the time record-keeping finally became common practice, they were already better known for their milk production than for their draft and beef production. It wasn't until the late 1800s that around 100 of them landed in Canada. Since they came from the colder climates of the Alps, they were expected to do just as well in the icy Canadian climate. And the Canadians were right. The Canadians quickly discarded their leather and draft capabilities and focused solely on their milk and beef. Draft animals were just not as much of a necessity with the rise of heavy machinery that could do 5 times the work in a fraction of the time. And quite frankly, there were plenty of other breeds that could yield just a little value with their leather. Back on European soil, the same would soon be happening to the brown Swisses that were still on their home soil. It wasn't long before they were brought to hotter climates to see how they held up. It was to be expected that they'd suffer from prolonged summers and extreme heat, but the Swiss surprised everyone. The breed, it turned out, was perfectly happy outside of the snow-capped mountains that they used to call home, and they did just fine with a little heat. For about 50 years since they landed, people just sort of forgot that they were actually pretty good beef cattle too. But the 1960s brought better living conditions and a booming economy. The craze for exotic foods started making its rounds, and the brown Swiss was marketed as Braunvieh, which just translates to brown cattle in German. If they were popular for their milk before, this new addition of a good cut of steak added to their dairy production caused their populations to boom, and they were well established in the US market as one of the most worthwhile breeds for a farmer to invest in. Their populations ballooned to monumental numbers. A 1990 census concluded that there were more than 7 million registered Swiss Browns in the US. These numbers are still reflected today. The Swiss in the US are sometimes referred to as the American Swiss brown cow to distinguish them from their European cousins. It's not that they differ much in breed standards, but the Europeans have kept them more as a dual breed, whereas across the pond, we've leaned more toward dairy production after the exotic meat craze cooled down. They're especially popular for homesteaders in colder climates who don't have as many options for dual-purpose breeds that can withstand freezing temperatures. In Canada, their lineage is very closely monitored, with a lot of breeding happening via semen imports from Europe to keep the lines pure. They've also separated the breed into 2 separate factions, with the brown Swiss being predominantly a milking cow and the Braunvieh making up the beef production end of the breed. The two haven't veered off in characteristics or breeding standards since the installation of the separation, and one is equitable with the other as of right now. But as the years go by, that is likely to change as they are kept separate from each other, and more focus is placed on one trait than others. Just like they've lost their ability as draft animals when they were no longer bred for that ability, separating them from each other will inevitably lead to the loss of the less dominantly bred for purpose. Only time will tell if the Swiss Brown and the Braunvieh will eventually become 2 separate breeds. We know we're here to hear about that magnificent milk, full of all the butter fat that you could hope to get. And we'll get to the production stats in just a second. But first, let's take a look at the attributes and characteristics that set the Swiss Brown apart. Any breed of sheep or cow that hails from Switzerland is bound to be a good grazer. People in the old days needed the hardiest and most efficient feeders that they could get. And in a place like the Swiss Alps, which has terribly harsh winters and less grazing available for livestock than the rest of Europe, anything that could survive there and be healthy had to be as efficient as possible. Look at the black-nosed Valais sheep as a good example. Like the Valais, the Swiss became large, efficient grazers. Their legs are short and stout, ideal for scaling rough terrain. And their hooves are unusually hard, meaning that they aren't prone to splitting, nor are they likely to give you as many problems as other breeds will when it comes to their hoof care. The veterinary and additional feed costs for Swiss Browns are among the lowest in the bovine breeds on Earth, and this ruggedness extends to their excellent birth rates too. Calves are smaller than average at the time of birth, making their passage into the world so much less problematic. Calves usually weigh around 75 to 80 pounds at birth. You'll almost never hear of a mother needing assistance. And don't worry about that small size. These babies grow with lightning speed, and before you know it, you'll have 2,000-pound bulls standing in the field. Cows are a little lighter than their male counterparts, growing out to about 1,500 pounds. Just shy of a full ton when they reach adult size, you can just imagine the amount of beef you'll get from a carcass. Under ideal conditions, they can live and thrive solely on pasture. This translates to leaner, less marbled meat. There's more than enough beef to go around, but don't expect all that much fat from them. Foragers never deliver on marbling, no matter what kind of livestock you are looking at. So as far as quality goes, it just depends on what you want from a cut. A lot of people prefer a leaner cut, where others seek out fat. In places like South Africa, where cattle are prized for the amount of fat that they can have on national foods like biltong, the Swiss Browns have been almost exclusively kept for their dairy. And speaking of pasture-raised livestock, the Swiss Brown is unusual in the sense that they can produce dairy of very high quantity and quality without needing additional feed. Even pastures that are of lesser quality won't bother them too much. If there's something to eat out there, the Swiss will find a way to leach every last drop of nutrition from their surroundings. A cow in her prime will give you 11,000 pounds of milk per lactation, and on the high end, she will give you as much as 25,000 pounds worth of milk. The only problem here is what any single household could possibly do with all of that product. The protein doesn't quite reach the percentages that Holsteins do, but at 3.5% worth of protein compared to the Holstein's 3.7, the two are so close that it's barely even worth mentioning. But the Swiss Browns do have a little more fat, standing at 4% of that valuable butterfat that you want from a dairy cow. A single cow will have around 15 lactations in her lifetime, with her first 5 being the most productive. Their teats are wide, having a slightly square shape to them. So if you're making use of a milking apparatus, be sure to look out for the appropriate size for your operation. If your suction nozzles are too small, squeezing her teats into a space that's too cramped will certainly lead to very painful and even deadly infections and chafing. And when you're dealing with this amount of milk, a schedule is utterly necessary. Mastitis will set in if your cow isn't relieved of her load when she needs to be. Don't get a Swiss Brown if you can't keep up with her, and the same goes for your other big producers like the Jerseys and the Holsteins. Furthermore, Swiss Browns are relatively adaptable to both ends of the spectrum when it comes to temperature. Icy winters or humid and blistering summers, they'll do just fine if they can be left to graze to their heart's content. They can handle much more heat than the Holsteins and Jerseys can. This high level of tolerance and their ability to thrive with less nutritionally dense pasture are what make the Swiss Browns stand out above the rest. And they are especially well adapted to stave off diseases like mastitis, displaced abomasum, and foot rot. Then there's their temperament. Swissies will be one of the most gentle animals that you can hope to keep on your farm. It's this docility that makes them so valuable to homesteaders. Those who are new to keeping bovines and families with children who are jumping in with the chores can't ask for an easier milking cow. It takes a lot to upset a Swiss Brown. If they have good grazing and are milked when they should be, they become very attached to their owners. Seriously, there's a lot of personality here to fall in love with, It's advised that you keep any bull that you intend to slaughter at arm's length. On a final note, Swiss brown leather is very sought after. They produce a soft, pliable, and high-quality product that is suitable for Milan's fashion shows. Back in the day, they were valued for this purpose too, but we've just made a habit of keeping them for milk and meat instead. So, like their drafting capabilities, it just wasn't so important that there was ever any real push to farm them for that reason. So if you have the equipment and infrastructure to work leather, it could be a lucrative side hustle for you. As always, every livestock animal comes with a few cons. Here are those worth mentioning when it comes to the Swiss brown cow. And let's start with the obvious. They are big in height, production, and in their teats. Don't make the commitment to get a Swiss brown unless you're prepared and capable of handling such a large animal. Bovines are usually the last animal that newcomers are advised to take on. Your cow can't skip a milking just because you happen to be sick that day. If you're keeping them for the milk, then you need to put everything in place so that your girls are never without the proper care. Keeping Swiss browns in a factory setting will lead to disastrous outcomes. They are strictly grazing animals. Confining them in cramped conditions will throw all of their natural disease resistance and docility out the window. You'll have an animal plagued by hoof and disease issues. They'll get so depressed that they just stop producing like they should, and the bulls will ram and fight their way out by any means necessary. So if you don't have a lot of acreage, at least make sure that your Swiss is on a rotational grazing schedule, and getting them a friend won't hurt either. Swiss browns are sociable animals. They don't necessarily need a whole herd to be satisfied, but a buddy goes a long way toward keeping them content and happy. Swiss browns can handle quite a lot of heat, more so than their milking counterparts can. But if you push them into the extreme desert heat, for instance, you'll see a drop in their milk production. You can make up for this stress by supplying them with extra nutrition, water, and plenty of shade, and by keeping more than one Swiss at a time. Sociability will go a long way toward easing the stress. After all that, the drop in production won't be nearly as noticeable as you think. If you're living farther north, where winters are cold and summers are lush, well, you couldn't ask for better conditions for them. They were developed in Switzerland after all, and that's the condition that they'll be suited for best. It's rare that heifers have trouble birthing, but when they do, it is usually necessary to step in with medical assistance. So keep an eye on your expectant mothers, just to be on the safe side. All in all, the Swiss brown cow is ideal in a lot of ways, especially if you're just starting to look into keeping your own milking cow for the first time. Small operations can keep a few at minimal veterinary and feed costs to make a decent side income. And for those that have smaller spaces to work with, well, there's always the need to have dairy at hand to keep a family supplied, so you're not forced to keep a large herd at all. If you're new and on a budget, the Swissies are one of the best options that you could ask for. But what about you guys? Have you ever had the pleasure of keeping a Swissie on your property? Tell us all about it. And for those just starting to dip their toes into the world of keeping a dairy cow, where do the Swiss browns rank on your list of options? Let us know in the comments below, and like always, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every bit of engagement from you is what makes it possible for our team to bring you the lowdown on every livestock animal that's just waiting to find a home on your acreage. Until next time, bye.